Another moment or two before we kick this thing off. Give another moment here and then we'll get started. Good afternoon, guys. Welcome to our today's installment of XenTegra's Webinar Wednesday, where today we're going to be discussing why Azure Virtual Desktop or Windows 365 coupled with Nerdio and IGEL is really the perfect match. But before we get started, there's a couple of things I want to discuss real quick and point out. One, we are giving away a 2022 Hunter Green Ford Bronco that is scheduled to be given away in May. So definitely visit the link on the screen there, the XenTegra.com/Bronco-giveaway to register to win that Ford Bronco. It's sitting in our warehouse and ready to be delivered to some lucky individual. But you got to be in it to win it. So definitely go out, register for that. And you could win a 2022 Ford Bronco. So one other thing to kind of mention, all attendees that had joined today will receive a Grubhub gift card. You guys will get an email with the details of that following this webinar as well. So with that, real quick, for those of you that are not familiar with XenTegra, we are a national reseller who invests heavily in our partnerships and the end user community by providing expert services, carefully selected products, and customer enablement, right? With events, workshops, and webinars such as this one. Wherever you guys are on your digital transformation journey, we can help you on your path to being successful. So, no matter what you have going on, definitely reach out. We can help you with your any sort of projects, engagements, consulting, things of that nature. This is Andy Whiteside. He is our founder and CEO. Andy founded XenTegra on the principle of serving the end user community, which we continue to do today. He was a Citrix sales engineer, left Citrix because he saw a void in that partner space where customers really just weren't getting the enablement they needed around the products that they had. So that's why he set out to do. That's where we are today. Today, we are that value-added reseller providing consulting services to our customers, no matter how big or how small. We also provide managed services, right? So if you need help supporting and managing your digital workspace environment, reach out. We can definitely help in that regard. And one thing to mention, if you haven't taken part or advantage of one of our complimentary assessments, I highly encourage you to do so. These are typically up to a 4-hour engagement where we will assess your environment, whether it be Citrix, VMware, it could be networking, whatever it may be. And we provide you a SWOT analysis of that environment where we list you at your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You can definitely follow up with us after this session if you are interested in scheduling one of those as well. So real quick, I'm going to do a quick introduction. My name is Randy Price. I will be your host today. I will be monitoring the chat. So if there's any sort of questions or comments, we definitely want to make this interactive. So feel free to throw that in there, and I'll be providing that to the any questions or comments to the Nerdio and IGEL guys. I live outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. I've been working in the, I guess, end user compute space, I guess you could call it, for 20 plus years. I've been with XenTegra for a little over 4 years. If you've ever engaged in one of our complimentary assessments or micro assessments, there's a good chance that I was involved in that. So for those who, again, I'm kind of passionate around that. So if that's something you haven't taken advantage of, definitely reach out. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to the Nerdio and IGEL guys. We'll let them introduce themselves, and we're going to discuss our topic today. Again, why AVD or Windows 365, along with Nerdio and IGEL, are really that perfect match. So, Vadim, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Randy. And let me share my screen. Okay, there we go. Welcome everyone, and thank you to the XenTegra team for inviting us to participate in the webinar. Really looking forward to talking to the audience here about AVD, Windows 365, and where Nerdio fits in. As a quick introduction, my name is Vladimirsky. I'm actually the CEO and founder of Nerdio. We founded the company several years ago and have really been working very closely with Microsoft on their AVD product, really even before it was called Azure Virtual Desktop and before it was called Windows Virtual Desktop. It was a project known as Remote Desktop Modern Infrastructure or something like that. I don't remember. RDMI was the acronym that Microsoft liked to use. So we were very close with the engineering team and working on building into an automation product that Nerdio had in market dealing with RDS deployments in Azure. And then once Microsoft was working on releasing Windows 365, they've asked us to build it into our suite of products as well. And we've been working with Microsoft as a Windows 365 integration partner, and we were actually one of the launch partners when that product came out last year in August, I believe. We've seen quite a few deployments and have a lot of experience with many different customers using our technology. We have well over 1 million users under management. We've seen between 3 and probably closer to 4,000 customer deployments since the product of AVD went into general availability, which was back at the end of 2019. And we're seeing quite a bit of new adoption, which is really accelerating. We're seeing, on average, 200 or more new deployments that are done with the Nerdio technology. So where I'd like to start and kind of talk about where Nerdio fits into the ecosystem of these Microsoft products. So there's really now 2 desktop virtualization products that Microsoft offers. There's Azure Virtual Desktop, which is designed to be a flexible Azure-based VDI platform, which is priced on a usage basis, so based on Azure consumption. And then there is the Windows 365 service, which is more like a desktop as a SaaS, software as a service offering, which is designed to be easier to deploy, manage, Microsoft 365 type of service, and it's licensed and priced on a fixed per user per month basis. Nerdio Manager, which is one of our 2 products. We have Nerdio Manager for Enterprise and Nerdio Manager for MSP. Nerdio Manager for Enterprise is an Azure application that connects into those 2 desktop virtualization platforms from Microsoft and adds a lot of enterprise class functionality that we'll get into a bit more detail as we go through our session today. But it really provides our customers with a unified deployment management and optimization platform for both Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 under kind of the same umbrella within the same portal. And it has many different features. We probably have well over 200 features that are added on top of what's available natively from the Microsoft products, and they fall into these 9 categories that are listed on this slide. I won't get into too much detail because we'll get into that on subsequent slides here, but things like cost optimization, image management, application management, DR and resilience, security, reporting, and monitoring, all of those kinds of things that customers need to operate a large virtual desktop deployment are built into Nerdio Manager in a very simple to use kind of way. If we get a little bit deeper into what it does specifically, we can start by looking at what is Azure Virtual Desktop consist of. What are the components of Azure Virtual Desktop? And the easiest way to think about it is that it has four pillars of functionality. There is the remote desktop client application that Microsoft makes available for all the various operating systems, whether it's a Windows or HTML browser or Mac or iOS, what have you, Linux obviously as well. So those are provided by Microsoft. There is then a Windows 10 and Windows 11 multi-session operating system that was released specifically for Azure Virtual Desktop that enables multiple users to connect to the same VM and get that traditional desktop experience rather than having to use a server class operating system. And Microsoft creates an agent called the AVD agent, which gets installed on those VMs. Then we have the admin experience. The admin experience is sort of not what the end user does, but obviously what the administrator needs to worry about. And this is done primarily through the Azure portal. And when AVD or WVD originally launched back in 2019, it was all PowerShell based. There was no Azure portal integration, no Azure portal UI for WVD, and Nerdio Manager provided that initial graphical interface to allow customers to deploy easily and manage their environments. And then finally, the fourth component is a gateway and broker and diagnostic service. It's basically a set of platform as a service offerings that Microsoft hosts on behalf of its customers as part of the AVD service. So think of what was known as the RDS roles that were necessary in the days of remote desktop services. Those are now fully managed Azure services that Microsoft takes care of, and customers don't have to worry about those. Nerdio Manager is an Azure application that extends the admin experience of AVD. It doesn't replace any of the other components. It's not a replacement control plane that that customers have to migrate into or migrate out of. It's an admin experience extension, which means that as Microsoft continues to make investments into AVD and all the surrounding services, customers benefit from those immediately without having to wait for Nerdio to integrate with those new features, although we do integrate with everything that Microsoft puts out, generally by the time it enters public preview, and certainly well before general availability. And the types of features that Nerdio Manager provides fall into these three categories. The first one is all about cost optimizations, just making sure that the Azure infrastructure cost of your AVD environment is as efficient as possible. And we're not talking about savings of 10 or 20% in Azure infrastructure. We're talking about very significant savings, 50%, 75%, and in some cases even higher in terms of hard dollars in Azure Compute and Azure Storage. And we'll look at specifically what does Nerdio do to achieve those levels of savings. In addition to the hard costs, there is also the increase in efficiency of the IT administrator, the people who are managing the AVD environment on a day-to-day basis, whether it's managing the session host infrastructure, whether it's managing user sessions, monitoring, really doing anything to support the AVD environment. Nerdio automates and simplifies all of the very common tasks, really increasing the IT admin efficiency very dramatically. So you no longer have to be an Azure engineer or a deep VDI expert to be able to manage even a very large AVD deployment with the Nerdio Manager. The second category of benefits is all about automation to increase reliability. And sort of a typical example of this is image management. Image management in Azure is a very powerful and flexible process, but it's fairly complex. It's difficult to do. It requires a lot of knowledge and expertise. And there are many places where you can make mistakes in the process and have to kind of repeat the whole thing from the beginning. Nerdio makes the whole image management process a very simplified experience. It's fully automated. So that means creating an image, rolling an image out to session hosts, updating the image on an ongoing basis, and doing all of that either manually in a way where an administrator would click the buttons to actually make that happen, or even being able to schedule that entire process of updating an image from, let's say, the latest Azure Marketplace image, installing all the applications automatically, and then rolling out that image to a user acceptance testing environment, and then eventually into production, can be fully automated end to end. Nerdio Manager also provides the ability to enable disaster recovery with AVD in a what we call an active configuration, where Nerdio Manager will split up the session host VMs across multiple Azure regions, and users will connect into both regions during normal operation. So if one of the regions goes offline, users can continue working uninterrupted out of the VMs that are running in the second region. We also have what we call a self-healing engine. What that does is it monitors the health of the session hosts in AVD, and if it detects any problems, it can proactively remediate those problems, all the way up to actually removing and recreating that VM and reloading all the apps and getting it back into operation, so that there's really zero admin involvement to have and go fix the problems. Nerdio Manager can detect the problem and fix it automatically. And then finally, the third category is all about simplifying management. This includes both the initial deployment of an AVD environment, the unified management of everything that has to do with virtual desktops in Azure. So we talked about Windows 365, obviously AVD components themselves, excuse me about that, AVD components themselves, and then finally, things that have to do with AVD. So everything like storage, applications, MSIX, FSLogix, everything that AVD sits on top of and integrates with is also built into Nerdio Manager. So you have a single pane of glass portal to manage all of these components. And then the final component is about application management. I mentioned MSIX packaging. We can leverage things like FSLogix app masking that lets you manage applications and multi-session host pools, and various other application management technologies. Now, what I'd like to do is dig a little bit into that claim I made that Nerdio Manager saves 50 to 75% in hard costs of Azure infrastructure. I want to talk about how we do that exactly. And if we look across our customer base and we look at what are the typical costs that are involved in operating an AVD environment, non-surprisingly, you'll see that the cost of the VMs to do the compute, the cost of the operating system disks for the storage of those C drives and applications attached to those VMs, as well as the storage of FSLogix, makes up more than 90% of the total cost of AVD. There's some other components that are minor, but primarily 90% plus is made up of those three components. And this is where Nerdio has made a lot of investments into optimizing and trying to really squeeze out every excess cost from all the different places in Azure that are not necessary. How do we do that? So I like to use this slide as an example to show where are some of these optimizations coming from. So let me first go through what are the assumptions that these numbers are based on. So the assumptions are a very typical multi-session deployment. We are assuming 192 users, but these numbers scale very linearly up. So if you have more users, it's just going to go up from here in exactly the same proportion. The type of user we're dealing with is what's called a heavy user, which means 2 users per virtual CPU core. We're going to be using an 8-core and 32 gig of RAM D8S V4 VM type in Azure. We're going to be using a 128 gigabyte premium SSD disk. We're going to be using a 20 gigabyte profile on average for each user stored on Azure Files Premium, with an average number of hours that the user works in a week of about 50 hours. And the pricing is based on the South Central US region. Pricing varies a bit from region to region in Azure, but not dramatically. So just so you know, this is based on South Central US pricing. And this is a very representative environment of what a typical, multi-session deployment in AVD would look like. So if you were to go ahead and deploy this environment in the Azure portal, we call that an unoptimized deployment. This is how much it would cost you for each component. So it would be $4,000 a month in VMs, $215 in operating system disks attached to those VMs, and then $737 for the FS Logic storage on the Azure file share. And on average, you'll see that the cost per user per month is about $26, which is obviously a very decent cost per user if you think that this is all inclusive of all the components needed to run AVD. But we can do much better than this price point. And here's how we do that. So we have 6 optimization strategies that Nerdio Manager enables, and there's more than this, but these are the common ones. The first 3 focus on the cost of compute, so mostly the VM and the compute meter that Azure charges for, and the last 3 are focused more on the storage side of things. So the very first one is kind of the obvious one. We call it VM power management, meaning making sure that the right VM is powered on at the right time. And when it's no longer needed, it is shut down so that compute meter isn't spinning when it's not needed. But we can do better than that because we also have something called just-in-time provisioning. Just-in-time provisioning is an ability to create VMs, not just power them on and off, but actually create and delete VMs when they're needed or in advance of them being needed, so that you're not paying for those powered off VMs and the associated operating system disks. Because even if the VM is shut down, the operating system disk that it's using, because it exists, is still being charged no matter what, as long as that VM exists. And what just-in-time provisioning allows you to do is create VMs as needed and delete them when they're no longer needed. And that's done completely automatically by the auto-scaling engine. Then the third optimization we call reserved instance analytics. Reserved instance analytics is a way to further save on the cost of compute, the cost of those VMs. And for those of you who are familiar with Azure reserved instances or reservations, you'll know that if you commit to a 1-year or a 3-year term, Microsoft gives you a very significant discount. It could be 40% or 60% off the cost of that VM as compared to a pay-as-you-go price. The challenge is when you're dealing with AVD and you're using auto-scaling, if you're buying a reservation for all of your VMs, it sort of stops making sense to do auto-scaling because you've already prepaid or at least committed to that capacity that you're now paying for, regardless of whether the VM is up or down. So what Reserved Instance Analytics does is instead of telling you, hey, buy reservations for all of the VMs, it analyzes the auto-scale behavior over, let's say, the last 30, 60, or 90 days. And it builds a profile that says, hey, if you buy this many CPU cores, which is a subset of the total, a small subset of the total, of this particular VM type in this specific Azure region, that would be your optimal balance between auto-scaling and reservations. And that could have very significant impact on the cost of compute in Azure. Now let's move on to the storage optimization. So the first storage optimization is called operating system disk autoscale. What does that do? So we've made the assumption down here that each of our session host VMs is using a premium SSD storage, which is fairly expensive in Azure. For the 128 gigabyte disk could be somewhere around $20 a month range. But when the VM is running, that's really important to have premium SSD because you want to make sure your users have good, fast performance while they're on their desktop. However, when that VM is shut down, keeping that disk being premium SSD is sort of wasteful because no one's using it. Performance doesn't matter because the VM is turned off effectively. So why would you be paying for premium SSD? So what operating system disk autoscale does is as the VM is powered off, it will automatically convert the premium SSD disk down to the cheapest storage tier, which is called standard HDD or spinning media disk, which costs about 25% of the premium SSD price. So it's a savings of 75% on the cost of that disk while that VM is powered off. And again, that has a meaningful impact. Then we have something called operating system disk shrink automation. So a default operating system disk size will be 128 gigabytes because that's the size of the image that Microsoft releases for AVD. But there's a lot of free space in that image. And if you keep your application stack pretty lean, you can even get down to 32 gigabyte disks. And the smaller your disk, the less it obviously costs you. So Nerdio can automatically take advantage of this available slack space inside of those disks and shrink them down to at least 64, and in some cases, even 32 gigabytes. And then finally, we have FSLogix. So FSLogix is the technology that allows user profiles to be containerized and stored on, let's say in this example, on an Azure Files share. Now, the way that works is each FSLogix profile is a virtual disk file. It's a VHD or a VHDX file, which is thin provisioned. And what that means is as the user begins using their profile, they're downloading data, they're synchronizing their Outlook, they're using files on demand with OneDrive, that VHD file continues growing and it never shrinks. That means that if the user deletes files from within their profile, the storage that their VHD profile occupies on disk actually doesn't change at all. It does not shrink in any way. And what that means is you're consistently paying for more and more FSLogix storage on Azure Files Premium without that ever getting smaller, even though not all of that space is being utilized. So what Nerdio Manager is able to do is it's able to go into each one of those VHD files and extract any slack space or any white space that's inside of those files, reduce their size on disk and do that on a recurring basis, and also then go ahead and shrink the Azure file share now that there is a lot more free space that's available on that file share that contains all of those FSLogix profiles, which again results in very significant savings. And what you can see from here is that we go down from an unoptimized cost of $26 per user per month all the way down to sub $5 per user per month, which is a pretty significant savings of 83%. And all of this happens without any impact on the end user experience. Things are not slower for them. They don't really know that any of these optimizations are happening in the background. And that's why it's kind of important to understand that an optimized out-of-the-box deployment, even though the cost is attractive to begin with, there is a lot of optimizations that can be done. And we find that on average, a customer pays for the cost of their Nerdio license with only the autoscale savings in less than a week of every month. So in 6.5 days, customers generally pay for the cost of their Nerdio Manager license. And then the remaining days of that month, it's obviously something that drops their overall cost and benefits them directly. So this is the cost optimization component of Nerdio Manager. I want to stop here and see if there are any questions about what we've covered so far. I want to make sure that this is interactive and you get a chance to ask any questions that you may have as we go along. So Randy, did I miss any questions in the chat that I should take at this point, or should I keep going?
I think you're good. There was one question earlier. Someone had posed, do you guys work with AWS? And I think we kind of answered that as well. But outside of that, there's no additional questions. But definitely, if you guys have questions, drop them in the chat window. We'll discuss them along the way.
Yeah, I think, Vadim, that what's really cool is just talking about those cost savings per seat that you're showing there, because usually we have discussions, with the client saying, hey, Azure is too expensive. We can build our own vSAN nodes and build stuff out and be around, $8 or $12 for vSAN nodes per user per month. And now you're showing, hey, you can get down to a fraction of that by using Nerdio. So very cool.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Some of you may be asking, maybe those of you familiar with the Microsoft AVD product natively, right? The question we get now that there is some auto-scaling capability that has been released into preview, like what's the difference? Does Nerdio do anything beyond what the new, preview version of Microsoft auto-scaling does? So we put a little slide here. We'll be happy to share that with you if you're interested. But just to give you a sense, Microsoft does basic kind of ramp up and ramp down scaling in AVD. Again, that functionality is in preview now, but Nerdio adds a lot more And from that slide that you saw previously, all of the storage auto scaling, the auto healing, various levels of aggressiveness, being able to choose what your triggers are for actually scaling up and down or in and out, things like CPU usage, RAM usage, number of sessions, all of those things Nerdio brings to the table and extends kind of native AVD functionality to really help you squeeze out, every additional access cost from the equation. And there's more, right? We're not done yet. We're working on other components of an Azure deployment to help you save even more on costs and improve that user efficiency and performance. And then the last thing I want to cover on the AVD component, and really this applies to both before I switch over to Windows 365, because we've been talking about AVD pretty much exclusively so far. But at the beginning, I mentioned Nerdio Manager sits on top of both products, on AVD and Windows 365. And the question I want to be sure I answer, like, what does it do for Windows 365? Can it save me any costs there? So before I do that, I just want to show what the product architecture looks like. And this is important, especially for customers that have high security, high compliance, data residency requirements, or anything that really doesn't lend itself well to a hosted SaaS solution that is shared with other customers. And the way Nerdio Manager works is that it's a single customer application. It is not a SaaS platform that is hosted by Nerdio on behalf of multiple customers. We create this application and push it out into the Azure Marketplace. And then it is a PaaS-only deployment. So there are no VMs, there's nothing to manage within that application, but it gets deployed from the Azure Marketplace into an organization's own Azure AD tenant. It consists of these 6 PaaS services that are from Microsoft. These are native services. So all of your Azure policies and authentication and Azure AD, all of that applies just like it would to any other Microsoft service. There is an app service, there's a Key Vault, Azure SQL, Azure Automation, Log Analytics, and App Insights. And then Nerdio Manager integrates with the rest of the environment through Graph API. So it doesn't do any sort of network-based connectivity. It doesn't need to have network presence. It does everything through Graph API. It integrates with Azure AD, where it has read access. And then it integrates with one or more subscriptions in Azure, where it has contributor access to certain levels, certain resource groups, and VNets, where it's allowed to create and manage VMs. It can create to any number of subscriptions. It can manage any number of regions. As a matter of fact, Nerdio Manager can be deployed across multiple Azure clouds. So you probably know there is an Azure, what's called Azure Commercial. There's also Azure US Government. There's Azure China, Azure Germany, and also Azure Stack HCI. That's sort of an on-premises version of Azure. And Nerdio Manager works with all these other clouds, and you can have a single version of Nerdio Manager running in any of those, managing VMs and session hosts and users across that entire Azure cloud estate. So it's not limited to a single tenant, not even limited to a single Azure cloud. So that is what I wanted to mention about the architecture. And one last thing, the application reports its metered usage to the Nerdio licensing service, but Nerdio has no inbound access into any of its customers' environments. So it's completely isolated and dedicated to a customer. You choose where you want these resources to live, what region, what resource group, what subscription, and who has access without exposing it to any third-party connectivity. Okay, so if there are no questions, what I'd like to do is switch gears and talk about Windows 365. Okay, so Windows 365 is more of a SaaS service similar to Microsoft 365 and Office 365 that is built on top of Azure Virtual Desktop. So if you look at sort of the guts of the Windows 365 service, it's leveraging the same concepts as AVD does, uses the same clients and the same sort of structures, but all of the complexity is abstracted from the end user because Microsoft manages all the infrastructure. They manage the VMs, they manage the storage, They give you the option to manage the networking on your own. But the point is, Microsoft takes on the cost of the infrastructure, and customers pay for this service as a license. And they provide this license to any user who is going to be using a virtual desk, a cloud PC, to use the correct terminology. And it's a licensed service just like anything else under the Microsoft 365 umbrella. So think about your, M365 E3 licenses. You buy 1,000 licenses or 100 licenses, you pay for them as long as you own that subscription, regardless of whether they're assigned to users, regardless of whether they're being used. It's a fixed per user per month cost. And that's exactly the case for Windows 365. Now, Windows 365 comes in 12 different flavors or 12 different VM sizes. It ranges from 1 CPU and 2 gigs of RAM, I believe, all the way up to 8 CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM. That's the biggest VM size. And new VMs, Microsoft has announced that they're going to be releasing new sizes, maybe GPU type workloads. So more than those 12 are going to be available in the future. But you basically have a discrete set of 12 sizes that you can purchase, assign to your users, and pay for it on a predictable basis. Now, so the question is, what can Nerdio do in that world? So there's several things that Nerdio can do on the deployment and management and performance optimization side of things. And we're not going to cover those very much today, but what I would like to cover is the license optimization component of how can Nerdio actually save money for customers that want to leverage Windows 365. And here's how this works. So if you look at a typical virtual desktop deployment, it doesn't matter if it's AVD, Windows 365, if it's on-prem Citrix or VMware. In a typical virtual desktop deployment, the number of what we call authorized users, also known as named users, is typically much greater than the number of users that are actually using the service on a regular basis. And as we look across our well over 1 million users, we found that for large organizations, that difference is pretty significant. And I'll get into the specifics of it. But if we standardize on 1,000 user organizations, this is just a hypothetical example, what we find is that of those 1,000 users, only 60% or 600 are going to be active on a regular basis. That means that there are going to be 400 users for whom you would typically buy a license and pay for a license that are really not going to take advantage of this Microsoft service. Now, if you look at what the cost impact is, if you buy 1,000 licenses of a $50 desktop from Microsoft, I think that's a 2-core, 8 gig of RAM, and 256 gigabyte of storage listed down here. That's going to cost $50,000 a month, right? Very simple math here, 1,000 times 50. But the truth of the matter is only 600 of these users are going to need a license. So what Nerdio introduces is the ability to automatically assign a license only to those users who actually go ahead and try to log into their desktop. So instead of pre-assigning those licenses and giving them to everybody, not knowing who's going to use it and who won't, Nerdio has a technology that can detect the user login and, assuming that they're authorized, can assign them a license in real time, thus reducing the number of licenses you need to purchase initially. So you may say, okay, I have 1,000 users. I don't know how many of them are going to actually be using the service, but I need to give all of them the opportunity to use the service. So maybe I'll buy 100 licenses first, enable the license auto assignment, and say, when I'm down to 10% free, give me a notification, send me an email. And then as users are logging in and those licenses are being consumed and assigned, once you're down to 10 available licenses out of that initial block of 100, Nerdio will email you and say, hey, you're down to 10%, you got to buy another block. You buy another 100, and you sort of only buy the number of licenses that you need based on actual utilization. Now, imagine a scenario where a user has logged in. It's like, hey, cloud PCs are available. I'm interested to see what it is. Let me log in. They get a license, they play around for a day or two, and then they never use it again. Whether it's because their work habits have changed, their workflow has changed, maybe they left an organization and nobody removed their license from them. But a lot of times what happens is that users who are active once become inactive and no longer use the desktop. And that's where Nerdio's unused license reclamation comes in, where it monitors user logins. And if it detects that the user hasn't connected for, let's say, 60 or 90 or 45 days, whatever the right threshold is for your environment, it can automatically reclaim their license, put the machine into grace period for 7 days, send a notification. So if a user logs back in, that license gets returned. And if the user doesn't log in for 7 more days, that machine goes away, and then the license can be used by someone else. And then the next thing that we found is that even as you look at the monthly active users, in our example, it's 600, the number of those users who are logged in at the same time is going to be even lower than that, right? So you're going to have pretty low usage on the weekends, and you're going to have kind of this higher usage during the week. But the peak concurrency, meaning the maximum number of concurrently logged in users, is going to be at some level. Let's call it 350 based on the analysis that we've done. So 35% of the starting point are going to be logged in concurrently. And what that means is that at all times, at least 250 users are going to be inactive, right? There's going to be more at other times, but at the very least, 250 users are going to be inactive. And what Nerdio Manager allows you to do is it allows you to do what's called inactive user parking. So what it will do is it will use a cheaper Cloud PC license to license the user while they're not logged into their machine. And as soon as they log in, it will return them to their fully priced license. So let's look at an example. The cheapest Cloud PC license is $20. And the one we're using in our example is $50. So you need a total of 600 licenses because that's how many Cloud PCs you're consuming. But you really only need 250 of the $20 licenses, and you need 350 of the $50 licenses. And then you look at that's a pretty significant additional savings that now you're not spending, extra money on these more expensive licenses. So the bottom line from this license optimization is you can save up to 55% in a large enough environment. If it's a very small environment, the discrepancy between named and concurrent and monthly active probably isn't pronounced. But in a large environment, hundreds or certainly thousands of users, these differences are very pronounced. And Nerdio Manager helps you squeeze all of that inefficiency and help you save more than 50% on the cost of the licenses. So, I think that's all I wanted to share today. We talked about the 2 Microsoft products, AVD and Windows 365, where Nerdio Manager fits in, and what are some of the cost optimization strategies to help you get the best bang for your buck when using those services in the Microsoft Cloud. I guess with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ron to talk about how IGEL can help in this scenario as well.
All right, thank you. Let me go ahead and you can stop the share and I'll take over. Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Are you guys seeing the screen okay?
Yes.
Excellent. So as Vadim was saying, as you're moving your Windows workloads now from those endpoint devices into Azure, where it's close to all of their other data, the OneDrive, all the other data that they've got up there, and Microsoft, it may not make sense to continue running Windows on the endpoint. So what IGEL brings to this is the ability to convert those existing endpoints and make them basically a Windows 365 or AVD client. So when they boot up their PC, their laptop, it's converted. It just goes right into AVD, they log in and they do their work. And so from the simplicity of that, all of the stuff that you had in place before with your SCCM config manager, your antivirus, all those other things you were trying to push out and manage those Windows endpoints, now that that's being managed with Nerdio in AVD, you can go ahead and take those endpoints and convert them. So basically, what we've got with this is just a focused, hardened device that is easy to set up, easy to manage. We have large customers that are managing, more than 30,000 devices per full-time equivalent to support them, right? all of that stuff is there. So you can see, you can take those existing PCs. So you may have a laptop where the battery life running Windows is, an hour or two now. You convert it to IGEL, and you've got a device that runs all day. You can extend those devices another 3 or 5 years out there. We also have a UD Pocket thumb drive that you can plug into any device. So if you've got other users that are contract, seasonal workers, things like that, you can assign them a UD Pocket. They could plug it into their existing PC, boot up and go. For business continuity, you can also use the UD Pocket and assign it to your users so that if their assigned laptop running IGEL was to fail, they could go ahead and plug in the UD Pocket into their daughter's gaming PC and continue to work, boot up, go right into AVD, everything's working fine while you get them a replacement laptop or whatever failed there. So really that's kind of the key. And then really the big picture here is with our alliances. What makes IGEL unique is that we have these relationships with 110 different partners that integrate already baked into the IGEL OS. So if you need things for more advanced analytics or printers, et cetera, you have that, it's already baked in. It's just going into IGEL management and just checking a box saying, hey, turn this on, turn this feature on. So very easy, very simple to set up. So that's kind of really that whole thing around the IGEL OS. We can run on any x86 based device. We've got that we can convert, we can do a UD Pocket and go. And then we have a whole IGEL Ready program. So we have partners like LG, Lenovo, HP that are part of the IGEL Ready program, so that you can go directly to an HP or a Lenovo or LG or whomever and get products already certified and ready to go with IGEL. So very simple there for new things. So again, converting to IGEL, you don't have to go and switch out your hardware partners. You can continue to use the devices that you have today and those hardware relationships that you have. And basically for the IGEL, for the install, you can install it on existing systems or use the UD Pocket and go. So that's kind of the basic gist real quick. All right. Any questions? Anything else there?
See, anybody got any questions? Feel free to throw that into the chat window. Definitely appreciate that, Ron.
Right. And I think the thing with XenTegra, you can work with them and their relationships with Nerdio and with IGEL to do any pilots or proof of concepts that you want to do with them. IGEL doesn't sell anything direct. We work with XenTegra. They would be your contact for all things IGEL.
So Ron, I did have a question come up. As far as the UD Pocket, there was a slide I think that you had that it was read-only, right, from a security standpoint. If you have a device, let's say it's a laptop in there, booting off the laptop, and maybe the laptop is infected with ransomware, how does that affect IGEL, right? So if they've got or does it, right?
Yeah. So we had a use case where a large hospital on the West Coast had a bunch of clients or end users that went home, and they gave them laptops with Windows, and in a short order of time they got infected with keyloggers, things like that. We were able to get UD Pockets out to them, and basically you plug it in and you securely boot off of that device, and it doesn't see anything about the underlying OS that was, or bad OS that was on the laptop to begin with. So yeah, so many use cases where we've done that, where someone has gotten themselves kind of wrapped around the axle, so to speak, with the ransomware keyloggers, that something you can put in real quick, keep the business going while you go. So yeah.
So from a centralized perspective, being able to manage these endpoints, ensure that they are secure in that regard, right? And that sort of use case. But
yeah. So the IGEL, as you're mentioning, is a read-only file system. It's hardened and secure, and by default, most things are turned off. So basically, you would go in there in the IGEL UMS or management console. You would check a box to say, "Hey, AVD," and set it up, and then check a box to say, as soon as the system boots, it just fires up AVD and it goes. So they never see any of the IGEL stuff behind the screen, right? It just, when this thing boots up, it's just presenting them with an AVD login and they go.
Vadim, I did have a question come in around licensing Nerdio. So how's Nerdio licensed, and does it include all features?
Nerdio is licensed on a monthly active user basis. So basically any user who logs into AVD during the course of the month is considered a licensed user. And the current product edition includes all of the features that we spoke about.
Very good.
And I think the other thing you guys can work with XenTegra to come through your ROI, TCO calculators to show, hey, moving these Windows workloads to Azure using Nerdio and IGEL, this is what your savings is going to be, and have a higher availability for your clients as well, or for you, yeah.
Right. And I guess from a next steps perspective, you know, and feel free to keep questions coming if you guys have any additional questions. I don't see any additional ones coming in, but from a next steps, right, definitely reach out. That's something you guys are interested in. If you want to see a demo or a POC, Nerdio, IGEL, we can do them together, right? It's a great solution. It's a great story, specifically around, you know, if you have tried to manage AVD natively, utilizing something like Nerdio, you'll definitely see the benefits, right, that it provides. So as well as, like I said, the cost savings. So there's definitely a great story there, along with coupling that with IGEL from an endpoint perspective. So any additional questions, comments? Okay, well, Vadim, Ron, definitely appreciate Nerdio and IGEL being on. You know, definitely a great story. You know, again, if there's any customers out there that are interested, reach out. You know, we did splash. I had the splash screen at the very beginning about the Ford Bronco. Definitely go reach out. Go out, check out that page. Register for that. We are giving that away here in a couple of months. Participating in some of these POCs and demos will get you registered as well. So it's a great way to get an additional registration entered into that giveaway. So with that, definitely appreciate the time. Appreciate everyone joining. Like I said earlier at the beginning, we will be reaching out by email to get you guys your Grubhub gift cards. So, all right, guys. Definitely appreciate your time today. All right, thank you, guys.
Great. Thanks for having us.
All right, thanks, Al. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.